Hi everyone, this PowerPoint is a short overview of the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. And I mentioned the irony in class that Johnson is not nearly as well remembered as John Kennedy, even though the Johnson administration accomplished far more than Kennedy's did. So let's take a look at the Johnson administration. Here you see a picture of Lyndon Johnson as a high school student, and then as he looked in the 1940s when he became a U.S. Senator. I mentioned in class that Johnson, I wouldn't say came from poverty, but his family struggled financially. Johnson was a bit of a hellraiser as a youth growing up, intelligent, but often not focused on schoolwork. His high school grades were pretty poor, and he had trouble getting accepted to college. Was finally accepted to a small teacher's college in Texas, and his first job was teaching in a small, poor school district in a border town, south central Texas, working with a diverse group of kids. And what he experienced in the way of poverty from those families impacted him, stayed with him for the rest of his life. Growing up, Johnson had always been fascinated by politics. He was involved in student government in middle school, high school, college, and after a short teaching career, got a job working on a staff of a congressman from Texas, and from that, successfully became elected to U.S. Congress himself in the late 1930s, and then moved up to the U.S. Senate in the 40s. So Johnson had a very long political career going back to before World War II. Some people were surprised that Lyndon Johnson, who by the time Kennedy asked him to be vice president, Johnson was Senate Majority Leader, so the most powerful Democrat in Washington, D.C., and some people were surprised he accepted Kennedy's invitation to be his vice presidential running mate. Frequently, being vice president kind of marks a dead end of a person's political career. Kennedy and Johnson were very different in terms of temperament, interests. Johnson, of course, was several years older than Kennedy. There was a significant age difference. He provided a nice balance to the ticket, though, with Kennedy being considered, inexperienced by some, even though Kennedy had been in Congress and the Senate going back to 1946. He was the youngest candidate to run for the presidency, and being a Massachusetts Democrat, Johnson being from Texas and a Southern Democrat, more experienced than Kennedy, provided a nice balance to the ticket. They did form a very effective working relationship, even though there were people within the Kennedy administration who never really got along with Johnson. I mentioned to the class that Johnson probably used the telephone more than any politician to that time, and so many of the official photographs taken during his presidency show him on the phone. He used it all hours of the day, way into the evening, and it was one of the tools that Johnson used to stay in touch with people. Johnson was a president who really enjoyed the give and take and the negotiating and sometimes having to compromise of politics. And he's working with people in Congress and the Senate, many of whom he knew quite well from his lengthy service in both the House and the Senate. Johnson, I mentioned in class, was physically large, 6'3", 200 pounds or so, and he used his physicality frequently to intimidate people, really, by getting into their personal space, leaning in close, touching them on the shoulder or on the stomach or the arm, as a way to persuade people to come around to his point of view. And I showed these pictures in class, a couple examples of Johnson doing this. You see him meeting with Martin Luther King Jr. in 1964. And Johnson had the furniture arranged in the Oval Office this way so that he could meet with people over the side of the office, where he could sit closer to them than if he was seated behind his desk. And I shared with the class this anecdote in 64 when Johnson's running for election and his vice presidential running mate, Hubert Humphrey, comes down to Johnson's ranch in Texas for the official announcement. And unknowingly for Humphrey, he didn't know Johnson was going to do this to him. Johnson made him immediately put on Western clothes and even made him sit up on a horse. It was all humiliating for Humphrey. He went along with it good-naturedly, but he wasn't happy. So Johnson formulated plans for what he called a great society, and it's interesting that he unveiled this idea at a commencement address at the University of Michigan in 1964. This was deliberate by Johnson because John Kennedy had been extremely popular with college students and young voters, and Johnson wanted to retain that support and tap into that energy. And so he unveils this ambitious plan at this commencement address, spring of 1964, University of Michigan, and he said, "The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice." The Great Society was an extensive, ambitious array of programs. Johnson immediately pursued passage of civil rights legislation that Kennedy had proposed but had been unable to pass. And this became the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended segregation in public facilities. Part of that also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, an important federal agency that dealt with instances of discriminatory practices based on both race and gender. The Economic Opportunity Act, Eric Foner talked about this, another important component of Johnson's Great Society programs. It included VISTA, program Volunteers in Service to America, which Johnson started as kind of a domestic version of the Peace Corps. Work-study programs for college students came out of the Johnson administration, along with Head Start, a preschool program designed to provide assistance and support, especially for lower-income kids, give them a boost before starting kindergarten. Medicare, Medicaid, both came out of Johnson's Great Society programs. Medicare, initially designed to help older Americans pay for health costs. Medicaid, directed toward lower-income Americans to help them afford medical care and health care. Both of these programs have major issues and are a big part of our political discourse today. There are many politicians who would like to expand Medicare and have a single-payer system similar to what most European and many Asian nations have. Medicaid's biggest problem is the fact that Medicaid benefits vary from state to state as it was created. And so depending on where you live, the benefits can be quite good. If you live in Massachusetts, and not so great if you live here in Missouri or someplace like Mississippi. Johnson administration was also the first presidential administration to provide federal funding for public education in the United States through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Johnson's legislation also established entities that are still around today, the National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities, and PBS, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So Johnson had an array of legislative success. Pay attention to what Foner has to say about these programs. Some of them were more successful than others. Johnson initiating all of these new federal agencies and federal spending and expanding the Vietnam War at the same time led to deficits and caused him to have to raise taxes. And the Vietnam War, which we haven't really covered because of falling behind, proves to be the undoing of the Johnson administration. Johnson planned to run again for election in 1968, but even a year before that, influential people in the Democratic Party had started seeking an alternative to Johnson, a candidate who had worked in the war. And after Johnson was nearly defeated in the first state primary in 1968 by a Democrat challenging him, a senator from Minnesota, Johnson decided to withdraw from the race. And after that, retired to his ranch in Texas, where, mentioned to the class, Johnson's health declined pretty rapidly to the late 60s and the early 70s. You die in the early 70s, only 65 years old. But Johnson had been a heavy smoker for years. He had a number of other health issues. His diet wasn't the healthiest. Seldom exercised, didn't get enough rest. All those things, catch up with you eventually. He did complete his memoirs, established his presidential library. I mentioned to the class, I thought it was interesting, Johnson's appearance in his last couple of years where he let his hair grow long and sometimes even wore it in a ponytail. And I had this slide that I took of Johnson's gravesite when I visited there several years ago as part of a study trip, group of social studies and history teachers from the Parkway and Rockwood school districts. And it was really interesting that Johnson is buried in the family cemetery with many of his forebears and ancestors. And his marker is just like everybody else's. You wouldn't know that a president was there just by looking in this area where family plot is located. Very much a contrast to many other presidential grave sites, and somewhat surprising given how bombastic and larger than life Johnson could be. But as I mentioned, a very hardworking, intelligent person. Johnson, as I shared with the class, could be quite crude at times, and sometimes people tend to remember him more that way today. But his was an important presidency that, as I said, took ideas that had been conceived in the Kennedy administration, but was able to bring them to fruition in a way that Kennedy was not.